Hey guys, welcome back to another great game of CEDH. Starting us off is Hidden Planet X on Tivit, Seller of Secrets. Clues, treasures, and time thief go hand in hand, with the ever-powerful Thrasios as backup. Next up is Elijah on Muldrotha. This is a graveyard advantage list, looking to fill its graveyard and use its commander to gain advantage while having access to multiple combos in the colors. In the third spot we have Dan on Kinnan. This is actually Combo Kinnan, eschewing the larger creatures for added combo line support and redundancies. And bringing up the rear we have Rob on Najeela. This is an ad nos variant, but the Warrior Princess is all about slamming a sea of warriors while letting you combo kill out of nowhere if left unchecked.
Hey guys, I wanted to pop in real quick to announce that we hit 5,000 subscribers on YouTube. I want to thank everyone so much for the support, and make sure to tune in as I'll be having a giveaway in the upcoming videos to show my thanks. But without further ado, let's get on to the gameplay.
Hidden starts off the game with a City of Brass. Elijah plays a Marsh Flats and cracks it for an Underground Sea, ending his turn with a Deathrite Shaman. Dan plays a Polluted Delta and cracks it for a Tropical Island. He then taps his land for a Soul Ring, but Hidden responds by paying 2 life to Mental Misstep it. However, Dan has his own Mental Misstep to save his Soul Ring. Rob plays a City of Brass and follows it up with a Jeweled Lotus, finishing his turn by cracking his Lotus for Najeela. Hidden unfortunately misses his land drop and ends his turn there. Elijah plays an Urza Saga and gets a Saga counter as it enters the battlefield. He taps his Deathrite to exile Dan's Polluted Delta to help him cast the Braids, a Risen Nightmare. Dan then follows it up with a Chromox, but doesn't imprint anything, with him at his end step triggering Braids. He sacrifices his Chromox, with no one sacrificing any other artifacts. Elijah draws 3 cards, with Rob, Hidden, and Dan losing 2 life. Dan plays a Command Tower as land, and then casts his Commander Kinnan. Kinnan arrives, but has nothing else to do, as Rob ends his turn there. Rob plays a Misty Rainforest, and cracks it for a Tropical Island. He heads to combat and swings Najeela at Dan, with his newly created Warrior token heading at Hidden. Both of them take the damage, with Rob on his second main casting a Chromox. He imprints a Culling the Weak and hands the turn over. Hidden plays out a Mox Opal, and needing the mana counters the Mox with an offer you can't refuse. Hidden gets his 2 treasures, but passes after that. Elijah draws, gets another Saga counter, and plays a Verdant Catacombs as land for turn. He uses his Deathrite to get rid of Rob's Misty, and along with 2 lands puts a Rhystic Study on the stack. Hidden will respawn as he cracks his 2 treasures for an Orcish Bowmaster. But in response to the Bowmaster, Rob taps his lands for an Intuition. Rob grabs a Breach, Savines, and a Gamble, with Dan ending up giving Rob the Gamble. The Bowmaster resolves and puts 1 damage on Najeela, with the study then resolving after that. Elijah then heads to his end step, triggers Braids, and sacrifices his Deathrite Shaman. Rob sacks Najeela, with Hidden and Dan taking the damage. Elijah draws 2 cards and triggers the Bowmaster. Hidden then shoots down the Kinnan, with Elijah then discarding land to do his overflowing hand. Dan plays a Gemstone Caverns as land. Luckily that turn 1 Soul Ring helps him recast his Commander Kinnan, with him then tapping the Gemstone to pay for the study. Rob starts off his turn with a Lion's Eye Diamond. He doesn't pay the 1 as Elijah draws off of his study. Hidden pings his Warrior with the Bowmaster, with Rob deciding to gamble. Elijah draws off the study, and the Bowmaster puts a damage on Braids. The gamble resolves, and Rob goes to find a card. He ends up randomly discarding a Brain Freeze, and then sacrifices his Lion's Eye Diamond for 3 white, which helps him flashback his Savines Reclamation. There's a Rhystic trigger on the stack, but responding to this, Dan casts a Mindbreak Trap to counter the Reclamation. Elijah draws off the Reclamation and the Mindbreak Trap, with Hidden having his Bowmaster deal 2 damage to Braids, killing her. Then, with his win attempt removed, Rob ends his turn there. Hidden heads straight to combat and swings his 7/7 army at Elijah, with Hidden on his second main casting a Mystic Remora. Elijah draws, with Hidden pinging Elijah for 1. With Elijah on Hidden's end step, cracking his Verdant to grab out a Bayou. Tapping the land to cast an Entomb. He triggers the Remora and lets Hidden draw a card. Elijah puts a Displacer Kitten in his grave and heads to his turn. Elijah draws and gets his third counter on his Saga. He taps the land for a colorless and grabs his Lion's Eye Diamond off the search. He plays a Tropical Island as land for turn and then casts a Demonic Tutor. He doesn't pay for the fish, with Hidden drawing another card. Dan plays out a Rhystic Study of his own and uses the floating mana to pay for Elijah's study. Dan can't pay for the fish, so Hidden draws, but the Rhystic resolves. Rob starts off his turn with a Mystic Remora of his own. Looks like everyone is copying each other. This triggers 2 studies and the Remora, but wanting to save his commander from the Boys, Dan decides not to draw, with Elijah joining in solidarity. Hidden draws a card, with Rob ending his turn there. Hidden starts off by taking 1 off of his City of Brass to keep his Remora. He plays out a Morphic Pool as land for turn and goes into the Think Tank. He ends up heading to combat, swinging his 8/8 army at Elijah. He then heads to discard and bins a Limdul's Volt. Elijah starts off with a forest into an Ashiok. He says he's not paying for anything, with Hidden and Rob drawing, and putting 1 point of damage at Kinnan with the Bowmaster. Elijah then downticks to mill himself for 4, hitting a Dothi Voidwalker, a land, Pact of Negation, and a Ramanop Excavator, while the table exiles their graveyard. Dan starts his turn by ending his turn. Rob untaps, pays for his fish, and then casts a Delighted Halfling. This will trigger Elijah and Dan's studies. Elijah draws while Dan passes on the draw, and 1 point of damage goes at Kinnan from the Bowmaster. Rob ends his turn there. Hidden pays 2 to keep his fish around, and then plays a Banamo, Schools of Water Edge. He then heads to combat and sends his 10/10 Orc army at Elijah. The Bowmaster heads at Ashiok also for 1 damage, with Hidden ending his turn, discarding a Mystical Tutor. Elijah starts off his turn by shocking in a Watery Grave. He taps for 2 blue and casts a Thassa's Oracle. Dan draws off of his Rhystic Study, and Hidden sends 1 point of damage at Ashiok. The Oracle resolves, and Elijah casts a Tainted Pact in response to the ETB. Dan and Hidden draw, with Hidden pinging Kinnan. Rob then draws, and once again, Hidden tries to ping Kinnan. This time, Dan responds with a Veil of Summer. He can't pay for Elijah's Rhystic, but this will trigger Rob's Remora as well. Both he and Hidden draw a card, with Hidden finishing off Kinnan with the Veil still on the stack. The Veil will resolve, with Dan drawing a card. Hidden then sends a damage at Elijah's face, putting him at 9 life. Then, with priority going around the table, Dan casts a Delay, targeting the Pact, and paying the 1 for Elijah's Rhystic. Rob and Hidden draw, with the Bowmaster pinging Elijah for another damage. Unfortunately, Elijah doesn't have a way of stopping the delay, thanks to the Veil of Summer, and the Pact is countered. He looks at the top 5 cards off the Thassa's ETB, and bottoms them all. Elijah then downticks Ashiok, and has Rob milling 4, hitting a Mana Crypt, Plateau, Deadly Relic, and a Swan Song. Dan starts off his turn by playing an Urza Saga as land for turn. He then taps 2 for a Phantasmal Image. Dan pays for the Rhystic, but with the image on the stack, Hidden casts a Chain of Vapor, targeting his Orcish Bowmaster. Hidden doesn't pay for the Rhystic or Remora, with Dan, Elijah, and Rob all drawing a card. The Bowmaster kills the Thassa, and with no other responses, the chain bounces the Bowmaster back to hand. The Phantasmal Image then comes in as a Delighted Halfling, with Dan then playing a Mox Diamond. He pitches a Homeward Path, with Rob, Hidden, and Elijah drawing. Dan then ends his turn casting a Root Coil Creeper, paying for the Rhystic this time. Rob pays 1 for his fish, and then plays an Exotic Orchard as land for turn. He casts an Esper Sentinel, and lets Dan and Elijah draw. Hidden untaps, and finally lets his fish die. He heads to combat and swings his 14/14 Orc army at Elijah, killing him. A polluted delta then comes out as land for turn, with hitting cracking it to find a tundra. He taps 2 for an arcane signet and lets Dan and Rob draw, following all that up with the Dranith Magistrate. He lets Dan draw and ends his turn discarding Italian due to hand size. Dan draws and gets another Saga counter. He plays an Ancient Tomb as land for turn and casts a March of Swirling Mist. He exiles a Cyclonic Rift to let him target the Delighted Halfling and the Dranith. He lets Rob draw 1 from the Mystic and 1 from the Esper. The March resolves with Rob floating a colorless off of his Halfling. Dan then taps 6 to recast Kinnan and follows it up with a Transmute artifact. Rob draws and then responds with the Swords to Plowshares, targeting Kinnan. Dan will get a draw this time, but Kinnan is removed, as Dan sacrifices his Soul Ring to the Transmute. Hidden now has a response, as he casts a Dark Ritual, with both Rob and Dan drawing. Dan then counters it with a Mental Misstep, and draws Rob a card again. Dan then searches out a One Ring, and taps it to draw a card. Next up, he casts a Felwar Stone. Dan is actually afraid of Hidden, and doesn't mind feeding a few cards to Rob. Dan then casts a Mox Opal and a Prophet of Distortion, but is done after that. Rob then heads to his turn and has his Halfling phase back in. He also lets his fish die and then plays a Tarnished Citadel. Next up, he casts a Culling Ritual, with Dan in response casting a Flusterstorm, hoping to keep Rob off non-green and black mana, even if Rob can pay for the copies. The Culling Ritual ends up resolving, with Rob getting 1 green and 10 black. He uses 2 black mana to cast a Wishclaw Talisman, and funnily enough, even with all this mana, doesn't pay for the Rhystic Study. Dan draws, with Rob then activating the Wishclaw. He gives it to Hidden, and then finds a card to hand. Rob then uses his black mana on an Adnaz, this time paying the 1. Hidden responds with the Force of Will, pitching a Whir of Invention. He lets Dan draw, with Rob responding with a Tainted Pact. He starts exiling cards off the top, with him grabbing out a Pact and Negation. He plays the Pact and lets Dan draw off the Rhystic. There are no responses to the Pact, and Rob begins to Adnaz at 30 life. He reveals a bunch of cards, and seeing his health total grow low, keeps going, only stopping at 2 life. Rob then grabs his pile and begins with a Mox Diamond, discarding a Windswept Heath. A Chain of Vapor then comes out to bounce his own Wishclaw, with Hidden not continuing the chain. Dan draws again, with Rob ending his turn discarding due to hand size. Hidden starts off his turn by phasing in his Dranith Magistrate. He plays a Spire of Industry as land for turn before heading to combat to put Rob's life at 1. Hidden then on his second main replays his Bowmaster to deal the last point of damage to Rob, killing him. Dan draws off the Bowmaster, but Hidden is done after that. Dan untaps and takes 1 from his ring. He floats 1 off his Urza Saga before sacrificing it, but in response, Hidden taps 3 for an Oppo Agent. Dan draws off the Rhystic, with Dan then tapping his ring to draw 2 more cards and get pinged for 2 off the Bowmasters. The opposition agent resolves, and Hidden goes to grab Dan's Mana Crypt. Locked out of searching for an answer, Dan plays a Force as land for turn and follows it up with a Lotus Petal. He uses his colorless and a blue to cast a Gilded Drake. He exchanges it for the opposition agent and follows it up with an Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2. Dan grabs a Bloom Tender and ends his turn discarding due to hand size. Hidden starts his turn by casting a Mana Crypt. He triggers the Rhystic Study, but Dan declines to draw to keep his Bloom Tender alive. Hidden then taps his Crypt and lands to play out his Commander Tivit, who won ETB gets 2 treasures and a clue. He goes to combat and then swings his Orc army and Drake at Dan. Dan blocks the army with the opposition agent and takes 3 damage from the Drake. Dan untaps and takes 2 from his ring. He plays out a Misty Rainforest as land for turn and cracks it to find an untapped breeding pool. Next up is a Finale of Devastation where X equals 3. He puts a Spellseeker on the battlefield and grabs the snap off the ETB. Dan casts a snap targeting the Gilded Drake, and once the Drake is balanced, recasts it. But this time Hidden is ready as he casts a Mindbreak trap. Dan draws off the study, and the Bowmaster deals 1 damage to the Spellseeker, killing it. In response to the Mindbreak trap, Dan hard casts a Force of Negation, with Hidden not having anything else as the Force counters the Mindbreak and the Drake trades with the Orcish Bowmasters. Hidden then heads to his turn and is saved from his Mana Crypt. Dan unfortunately didn't do the math when he took the Bowmaster, as Hidden then turns his board sideways. Dan has to block the Orc army with his stolen Bowmaster and takes 10 damage, dropping to 2 life, with Dan on his upkeep dying to his One Ring Burden trigger.
Game review. Well, from missing a land drop to getting fed off the fish, man can games change at the drop of a hat. But as the title says, I actually think turn order mattered this game, and not that Hidden just went first. But he ended up using his turn order to force his opponents into using their interaction before he had to. Granted, with all the extra card draw that was happening, Bowmaster was really the star of this game. Getting to remove creatures while also pressuring people's life total, man, that card slaps. Thanks to everyone that joined for the game, and before everyone leaves, I want to thank our special Patreon members, Slyfox, Tango Down, and Holy Septic for their support of the channel, along with all of our other Patreon supporters as well. And remember, never give up, even if you're dead on board. I'll see you guys later.